Morning, Michael Fisher, and today I want to talk on this video about Liberation Peer Counselling Plus, which is LPC for short. And the plus refers to upgrading some of the ideas behind Liberation Peer Counselling, which I've been teaching off and on and practicing for over 30 years. The model basically is peer-to-peer, how two or more people can give attention to another in a compassionate way, a compassionate witnessing, not merely witnessing, as in when someone is suffering, but this practice of LPC refers to being with. So we add the H into witnessing as witnessing. And it's this process that is ultimately, what's the purpose, is to exchange compassionate gaze, compassionate attention, unconditional attention, sometimes called, in a peer support way that encourages the person to liberate themselves from distress, suffering, all forms of oppression. So that's the liberation part, is to go beyond our identification with and our embeddedness in an oppressive world, often that is very gross and very harsh, very hurtful. And the other word is violence, and I'm coming to the place of not using the word violence or abuse as terms that I don't think are all that useful, that they have to be accompanied with the word hurting. In other words, violence/hurting, or hurting/violence, abuse/hurting. And I believe it's only in these words, when we bring in the word hurting itself, that one can begin to move down a road of healing rather than coping with violence or getting justice against violence and abuse and so on, injustice. So these are words that are very political that I've just mentioned, and the one that's not so political is hurting. I think it takes it to another level. So I'm just going to start this video to say that I'm not going to try to talk about Liberation Peer Counselling in theory and practice in a big way. This is a very short video that I want to really look at the concept or the topic of peer-to-peer counseling using LPC as I've come to understand it and have utilized it from other models of peer counseling that I believe are particularly unique. Reevaluation co-counseling being one of the ones I learned early on. So the focus of the video is counseling, and again, I could use the word witnessing instead of counseling. Witnessing another outside of the distress patterns. That doesn't mean, I'm trying to be all cheery and try to be positive and get people to just focus their attention off or outside of their distress, their hurting, but to actually realize that we know we're hurting. We know we've been attacked in life. We know we're attacked constantly under various ways. Just living in a capitalist system that is oppressive. So again, that's all bigger part of the theory I'm not going to go into of peer counseling. But I'm going to start with a little story that brings to this notion of, well, what would it look like? What would it mean to counsel outside of the distress pattern, or what's sometimes is called just balancing attention, both inside the pattern of distress and outside the pattern of distress, as I am counseling someone as a peer, and as they receiving that gift of witnessing compassionately, as they receive and also move themselves to not just focus on their distress in the moment or in the past, the trauma and so on. So that's where I'm going with this, just this kind of a little seminar on a particular technique, really, I guess you could call it an orientation that reframes ways that humans can be with each other compassionately. A larger topic on compassion that I have a lot of critique about in ways it's being cast and marketed even today. It's good to see that it's getting more attention. It's coming into schools. It's coming into various nursing practices and so on. How to be compassionate. Those are often not liberation models. Just to say that off the top. Start with a little story about why I think this is so important to counsel, balance our attention outside of distress patterns when we're doing peer-to-peer work. And just living life itself, because what we do in peer-to-peer counseling is also, of course, a model for how we operate and live and organize our lives in the world in general. The story is, you may have heard that off the coast of Victoria right now in the San Juan waters, Strait of San Juan, San Fuca, I guess it's called, and there's a killer whale, a mother, member of a pod of whales, killer whales out there. She's well known. She's marked by researchers, and she's just had a calf that died within, a fairly short few minutes after death. And she's been carrying this calf, her child, around with her for, I think, 9 days now, going into the 10th day full time, which means she's, quote, the media says she's dragging it around, which means she's balancing it on her fins or her head, and then getting exhausted by doing so because she's not obviously feeding in the normal ways. So she's running herself down. At least that's what we see at one level. And then the reports show that the pod, the rest of the social group, a social creature that whales are, and they're, of course, known to be incredibly intelligent. There's all kinds of ideas about, well, how are they helping, and what's this message to humanity? So they're also helping apparently carry this fetus around, and the rates of birth and death, high mortality, is a concern to environmentalists right now, that something like only 25% of the killer whales in that population off the west coast of Canada are surviving. They are dying early. Okay, beyond all those messages, one of the things you see in the emotional media, the fear-based media, as I call it, the culture of fear, and the way it portrays stories of human suffering, whale suffering. This attempt to be compassionate with the whale, that we're giving it so much attention, right? And it sounds like a good thing. And yet, if you listen to the way we give the attention, this is really the issue I'm getting at in this video. I'll get to. The attention is all on, oh, the poor mother, she's wearing herself down, and oh, look at the great burden that this is for the pod, and oh, isn't it sad that this young one never had its life to live its full potential, and so on. And there's this great outpouring of compassion, which is really witnessing, not the witnessing that I spoke about earlier. Problem with it? I'm glad that we're connecting with another species and care about another species, or care about another organism, another being. This is great. Good start. However, the focus is all on the suffering. In other words, the distress of not only the mother, the distress upon the pod and its sharing of this burden. And it's been 10 days, right? And the media, of course, loves to follow these stories. And researchers are following it for other reasons. They want to find out why the calf died, which is a good scientific thing to do. But in all that, the focus of attention is on the distress. And so the actual watching and observing of the creatures, these beautiful killer whales, is on watching their distress. And in fact, in a certain kind of subtle way, kind of reinforcing that life is all about suffering. Of course, I know the Buddha said that, but the Buddha had a very different notion of what that meant than the media does in popular culture. So the focus is on the suffering of the whale and the burden. And that's what can happen in most peer counseling and support work. Not all, but the person gets attention from another, and the purpose seems to be, okay, now let's focus on your traumas, your hurts from the past, and okay, I'm going to really give you compassionate attention. Well, in peer counseling, when I say a witnessing process is going on of compassion, it's not just compassion for suffering, hurting. The basic principle is that when we're hurt, we'll heal. That's the real simple premise, and I think has a lot of evidence behind it. Well, what about the whales? They're hurting, in grief, and they're healing. When you're hurt, you'll heal. In my own work, and I won't go into it here, but when in fear, so then does fearlessness arise. It's an automatic, self-regulatory, innate, 4 billion year old pattern of grace, if you want to call it, that the healing process does exist. And it's innate. So nobody's focusing on the intention that I've seen in the media of, oh, the whales are actually healing now. Oh, they say they're grieving and they're mourning, and make a big deal that they're sort of like humans because they're doing this sort of funeral kind of process. But actually they're healing, and arguably the mother is in a process of healing. And how can we as humans, witnessing the whales in some subtle way perhaps, actually encourage that healing? Well, that may sound a little weird. How do humans actually affect whales? And well, whales are affecting us emotionally. So I kind of started thinking, well, maybe there's subtle ways in our witnessing, being with these whales. Be with them by giving attention to how they're healing. So that's outside of the distress pattern. Lay that story of the whales aside for a moment now, return to peer-to-peer counseling. So how do we do this in peer-to-peer counseling is to have a session with the person that you're with and ask them and have a conversation, and maybe say, well, let's do a counseling session where you get attention, if you wish, and I would encourage it that we balance our attention on as much on distress as balanced on outside of distress. In other words, human potential, the great human potential. I want to witness with you. Thich Nhat Hanh says this. He's come up with these contradictions, or I'm using the word contradiction as an LPC term, that he uses in his own practice as a contemplative monk, Buddhist. And one of them is to look at the other person with this gaze and giving attention, type of pure counseling. He wouldn't call it that. I am with you. Very simple phrase. And that is in LPC theory what we call a contradiction. It's contradictory, that statement and that intention and that sincerity and those words, for pretty much most human beings who live in a modern society, I'll say at least, to actually believe, to hear, to sense someone is with me. That's a contradiction, especially in a fast-paced society that people are so busy, and I can be with you for only so long, and then I'm off, and most of the time I can't really be with you because I need you to do something for me to be with me so I can get this accomplished and go get groceries. So if you think about children, which is a fundamental observation within LPC, we're attempting to watch how children get attention, and often get it in ways that is not very helpful. In fact, is actually hurtful. I believe these are universal patterns that happen to humans. LPC theory works on that observation. People around the world have used these peer counseling models. It's not just a white American middle class phenomenon or practice. So that's one way to counsel outside of the attention being stuck and focused on the suffering and that part of the healing, which is a struggle. It's a battle to go back into those wounds and re-get attention for them and work through them. We know that's a struggle. We know that's not easy. We know that it creates a lot of fear. But the focus on counseling outside of distress pattern is to make the whole session about getting attention from the other. Like the mother gave attention. In our most primary early condition, this is what we might call the ideal mother-child. The mother is an I, the child still is a non-I, developing to become an I. So I'm talking very early, either both in the womb or in the very early perinatal developmental year, before really a self psychologically is developed in the child. So they're in some sense kind of a stranger, a non-I to the world, and the mother is still attempting to figure out who this person is, right? But there's a compassionate witnessing that is so automatic from the mother. Again, I'm using an ideal kind of mother-child bonding here. And that is the beginning of a peer-to-peer relation, even though the child is giving attention back to the mother, that they're not giving it to the mother in the sense of, let's give compassionate witnessing here. Let's give love. No, the child doesn't even think of that. The child doesn't hardly know itself as a self in that kind of way to do so. It will learn that more or less. So the peer counseling outside of distress would be like the mother attending to the infant in this sort of joyful, delighted way of, I am here with you. And the mother might just be watching the child, maybe laying there, kicking on the crib, kicking in the crib, right? And sucking its foot for a moment. Compassionate witnessing. I am with you. You know, the ideal, the mother doesn't just sit there in a sort of objective way, oh, what's that child doing? You know, scientific study of they're sucking their toe or making these googly, wonderful googling sounds as if to explore, you know, their lips and the sensory and the saliva and the bubbles and the sounds. That attention is outside of distress. It's outside of the child's need for hunger and what might be a crying or a pain or maybe cold. You know, there's a lot of things that bring distress to the organism, the human organism especially. We're pretty vulnerable, naked species. So that mother's witnessing is outside of distress. It could be a father, it could be a caregiver, it could be a sibling, anybody who comes up and gives that kind of attention. We often see that with young children when they're brought into a room or down the street. It can sometimes bring out this automatic witnessing and witnessing both. Wow, there's a new human being to the planet, and what a gift they are. And people just can change their temperament, their mood from their own suffering. So this is the kind of beauty that of what can happen when we counsel in this balanced way with attention, not on just the distress, the suffering, but actually balance it. And good practices, try to do 50% of on the distress, 50% off the distress. You could do that. I'm talking to peer counselors right now who practice this. You could do that within a session, balance it 50-50. You could even time that with the timer. And or you could just suggest that, you know, if we're going to do 6 sessions of co-counseling together in a series, and we've made a commitment as peers to do that, that let's do half of those, maybe every second one on distress and every second one on off of distress. So that's called a contradiction, because generally, like in the story of the whales, we have this great attraction to the siren, the emergency, the crisis, the trauma, the fire engine, the ambulance that pulls up in the neighborhood, to focus on the distress rather than in that moment. What if we focused on outside of the distress pattern, outside of the dramatic attraction, the dramatic display, the pain, the ugliness, the death even of life, part of life. All right, I think that's really the foundation of what I wanted to do in this video. I look forward to your feedback on it, and if you want to look up more on Liberation Peer Counselling, you'll find it on the internet. I've published a few things, and I'm also have more documents that I can share, and look forward to it. I will be planning on doing more teaching, not just using videos, but every once in a while I'll do a video. Okay, bye now.